let's go. Yeah, let's go. If I go, I'ma get. When I flow, I'ma hit. And I know I'm the kid. I'm a soul, don't forget. I'm a blood.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome to my ultimate P90 Bullseye build guide. In this guide today, we'll be going over the P90, and this weapon is so ridiculously strong and so much fun to use. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so before we get into the weapon stuff, we have to go over what is Bullseye. And Bullseye at its base is actually extremely simple. So what Bullseye is that when you shoot an enemy, you are going to end up marking the enemy, and it's going to give them like this little highlight outline. And when the enemy is highlighted, you're going to be dealing 8% vulnerability damage to that enemy, which is essentially just 8% more damage. And while it seems really simple and not that complicated, it adds up and it gets even stronger as we go on into this build. So Bullseye is really simple as far as how it works, and we're going to see how to make it even stronger. All right, so now that we know how Bullseye works, we can get into how the actual weapon itself works. So the way the P90 works is that it has a base 20% chance to apply the Bullseye on hit. Every 12 hits, you will trigger an AoE blast that would deal weapon damage equal to 800% attack to enemies within an 8-meter radius. This is one of the big things about this weapon, is that it doesn't just do single target damage. No, you are going to be doing an enormous AoE damage blast, which is what makes this weapon so ridiculously strong. And as you can see from this clip right here, I am triggering this AoE blast by shooting the dummy in the middle, and the left side and the right side dummy are both being hit by this AoE explosion. This is insanely strong, and it does a lot of damage, and it makes the weapon so much fun to use. And on top of that huge AoE damage blast that you're going to be dealing to enemies, when you hit an enemy or multiple enemies, you will also be getting ammo back. So now not only are you going to be getting that huge AoE damage blast, you are also going to be getting ammo back. Now this can go anywhere from 3% all the way up to 15%. It just depends on the amount of enemies that you hit. If you only hit one enemy, you're just going to get 3% of your ammo back, which you can get up to 15 if you hit multiple enemies. This makes it extremely good for things like Nightmare Silos or Leah Labs. And this just stacks on top of that amazing AoE damage blast and makes it so much better. And then the last feature on this weapon is that you will get crit rate plus 20% against targets with the Bullseye. Now this is just going to be a base 20% crit rate when you are just shooting enemies, which you're going to be consistently proccing Bullseye on the enemy. So this is a huge buff right here. And as you can tell from this one line, we're going to be building this weapon purely crit, and we're going to be focusing on crit rate, crit damage, and weapon damage to make this thing insanely strong. Alright, so now getting into the weapon's calibration, you are going to want to run a heavy style double crit rate calibration. And the reason for this is because the heavy style, you will get that increased ammo capacity, which if you remember on the weapon, you do reload your ammo back as you are triggering that AoE proc. So this is going to be triggering even more procs, and you're going to be getting even more ammo back. And the more ammo that you have, the more damage that you are going to do. And we are running the double crit rate because this is a crit based weapon, and that crit rate is going to make almost every single one of our bullets crit, and this makes it so much better. Alright, and so getting into the mod for the weapon, we will be running vulnerability amplifier, which what this is going to do is this is going to give you an additional 8% vulnerability, which is going to stack on top of Bullseye's 8% base vulnerability for a total of 16% vulnerability. So you're going to be getting 16% more damage technically, which is very beneficial since this weapon does base its damage off of weapon damage and crit damage. And as well, we are running this in a violent suffix for that crit damage. You can as well get weapon damage on this. Now, the reason you don't want to run a Bullseye suffix on this weapon is because the Bullseye suffix will only base its crit damage or weak spot damage off of enemies marked by the bullseye. So while it does seem like it could be more, the violence suffix is going to make every single one of your crits do more damage. So this is ideally why you want a violent suffix on it, and you can get crit damage and weapon damage, which is ideally what you want to aim for, as well as normal enemy damage or grave 1 damage. Both of those options are good as well. Alright, and so getting into the weapons attachments, for the muzzle you are going to want to run the multi-break. The optic, you are going to want to run the compact reflex sight. You are going to want to run the tactical laser sight. And for the magazine, you are going to want to run the weighted SMG mag for that increased ammo capacity, because like I said, this weapon bases its damage and reload procs off of the magazine. So the more ammo that you have, the more ammo you will be getting back. And for the ammo, I am running tungsten SMG AP ammo. Now, this is just because I can't really afford the smart SMG ammo, which is ideally what you would want to run for that 10% increase in damage. However, it takes electronic parts, and this weapon eats ammo like insanely fast, so this gets really expensive. So this is ideally the best ammo that you can use for this weapon. Now, if you can't afford that though, however, you can just use the tungsten SMG AP ammo, or even the regular tungsten ammo is fine. This weapon does an insane amount of damage, and it would not be that big of a damage difference. Alright, and so getting into your secondary weapon, so there will be 2 different weapons that we're going to go over. So the first one will be the Sandstorm Shotgun, which this is going to be your Fortress Warfare buff weapon. Now, the reason we're running this instead of a bullseye weapon is because you don't really need to run a bullseye weapon since your main weapon is already proccing the bullseye effect. So what this is going to do is when you switch to the Sandstorm, you are going to proc Fortress Warfare, which it doesn't last for very long. It only lasts for like 5 seconds. However, this will give you an enormous 20% damage boost. And that's not even including the Cradle, which we're going to go over later on in the video. So straight off the bat, you are getting a 20% damage boost, which is going to benefit this SMG significantly. And it is extremely quick to use because all you have to do is switch to it and switch back to your main weapon, and that's it. It does have kind of a long cooldown of 20 seconds. However, it will be over before you even know it. And this is a very good option for everything, whether you're doing bosses or silos or anything like that. This is highly recommended. I would pick this one over the next option any day. Alright, and then getting into your second option that you can be using for this build, we have the recurve crossbow. Now, I know I just said that the bullseye weapon as a secondary would be useless. However, the recurve crossbow is a little bit of an exception. If you are lacking in the crit rate department with your main weapon, and once you have everything built and everything, you can use the recurve crossbow, which when you do shoot this weapon, it will afflict the bullseye, which we're not worried about. However, when you do hit a weak spot, you will get crit rate plus 15%. So this could be a nice little 15% increase in crit rate. Now, this can actually be very beneficial, especially to actually make up the crit rate that you're missing. However, most likely you will not need to use this. It is still a viable option though, if you don't want to use the Fortress Warfare weapon, or you are just trying to get more crit rate. Alright, and so getting into the melee weapon for the build that you want to use, we of course have the Key. I really tried to pronounce it correctly that time. I know I can't say it. If you don't leave a comment in the chat saying you said it wrong, I know, I'm so sorry. But so the Key, when you defeat a target, it grants all weapons attack plus 30% and crit rate plus 15% for 10 seconds. This is like the holy mother grail of all weapons. If you don't have a Key, what are you doing? Go get one. This will like increase your DPS significantly, and it's absolutely insane, especially with the P90 itself. This is very nice to have, and it gives you a huge damage bonus. And I can go on and on about this weapon, but to save time in this video, just run the Key. Just trust me. Alright, and so moving on to the key item for the build, we'll be running the Blood-Stained Tracker Boots, which this is a new key item that just released along with the weapon itself. And what this does is when applying the bullseye to an enemy already marked by the bullseye, your attack increases by 20% for 5 seconds, and the bullseye spreads to one other nearby enemy. This is huge, and this is the key item that you can be using for like 90%, 95%, I want to say, of situations, because you're going to be getting a 20% damage increase. Even though it's only for 5 seconds, it is still a base 20% damage increase, and the bullseye will be able to spread to one other enemy. So this key item is like using one of the weapon mods that lets it spread to another enemy, as well get a nice 20% damage bonus. So you cannot go wrong with this key item. This is by far the best key item for this build. Now, if you did not want to run the Bloodstained boots, or if you were just simply only doing bosses, which you don't have to use these, but you can use the Earthly boots, which will give you a 30% base increase in damage against enemies affected by the Bullseye. This is the boss only option. If you really want that extra 10% more damage, it is a viable option. You can use this as well. However, I would highly recommend using the Bloodstained Tracker boots for most situations. Alright, and so moving on to the armor, you will be running a 3-piece Savior set followed by a 2-piece Lone Wolf set. Now, the Savior set is the new type of meta, especially with the Lunar Scenario. They recently changed it, so now the Savior set bases all of its stats off of shield based, and how this works is that 2 pieces, while shielded, weapon damage and status damage dealt increases by 10%. So that's just any amount of shield. You will be getting weapon damage and status damage 10% increase. And at 3 pieces, which is the most important part of this, it consumes 8% of current HP upon hit to generate a temporary shield equal to 5% of max HP, which lasts for 30 seconds. Now, this does have a short cooldown of half a second. I will tell you that there have been times where the 30-second timer ran out and you are at 1 HP and you get one shot. It does happen. Most of the time, it does not happen though, but it does happen every once in a while. But this is very, very big. We are in a shield-based meta at the moment, and once we get into the Cradle as well, you're going to be getting damage bonuses from that also. And this 3-piece Savior set is honestly the best set at the moment for almost every single weapon in the game. Now, if you did not want to run the 3-piece Savior set, if you wanted something more easy to use, upkeep, and maintain, you can just run the 3-piece Treacherous Tide set, which will initially give you more damage anyways than the 3-piece Savior set will. However, you won't be getting that shield damage bonus or those constantly regenerating shields. So that's why we're running the Savior set. Or if you feel like you can't upkeep the set, the 3-piece Treacherous Tide set works just as well. But we also run this with a 2-piece Lone Wolf set for that crit rate 5%, which is always nice, and that magazine capacity bonus of 10%. So you can't go wrong with this. This is the best option for this weapon. So now getting into the mods for the build. For the helmet, we'll be running Faithful Strike, which you cannot deal weak spot damage, but you get crit rate plus 10% and crit damage plus 30%, which this is a crit based weapon. So this is going to benefit us significantly, and we aren't worried about that weak spot damage because we want to make every single bullet in this weapon crit. So we're going to be getting 10% crit rate and 30% crit damage, which is just going to smack on even more damage and crit rate. As well, we are running this in a lunar suffix for that crit damage increase and that weapon damage increase that you can get on this. Now, this can go significantly higher. My crit damage only goes up to 18%. However, that can go all the way up to 30%. And with the Savior set and all the mods on the build, you are going to be at 1 HP. So you will be getting that full 30% crit damage bonus, as well as that full 12% weapon damage bonus. So that is why lunar mods do significantly more damage, because of that high crit damage and weapon damage that you can get. And especially since we are in a shield-based meta at the moment, you don't have to worry about being 1 HP because your shield is going to be consistently up for most of the time. So you're going to be getting that maximum damage increase from the Lunar Suffix mod. Alright, and so moving on to the mass mod for the build, we are running Targeted Strike, which Targeted Strike, when hitting marked enemies, you will gain crit rate plus 10% and crit damage 25%, which is just going to add even more crit rate and crit damage on top of all the other crit damage and crit rate that we have. And I'm also getting tired of saying crit rate and crit damage, but that's literally what this weapon is, and it's how it deals most of its damage. And we are running this one in a Violent Suffix for that crit damage and that weapon damage. Now, the reason we are running this one in a Bullseye Suffix, just like the weapon mod, is because the Bullseye Suffix will only work against enemies affected by the Bullseye. However, when using a Violent mod, you will get that crit damage and weapon damage no matter which enemy you hit, whether they are affected by Bullseye or not. So this works very, very well. Alright, so moving on to the armor mod, we will be running Rejuvenating, which Rejuvenating, when shield is above 30% of max HP, defeating an enemy recovers 20% of max HP with excess recovery is converted into shield, lasting 20 seconds. So forget the first part of it. The last part is what you want to get. The excess recovery is converted into shield. That is what we are going for. That is the reason you are going to be at 1 HP. So that instead of getting HP back, you're going to be getting shields back. So on top of the savior set generating shields, you are as well going to be generating shields from this top mod as well. So you're just going to have consistent rotating shields generating, and it is so nice. You do want to make sure that you are at 1 HP, however, when using this, so that your HP doesn't come back instead of shields. But this is a very nice mod to use, especially for that shield that you will be getting every single time you get a kill. So this ties with the savior set extremely well, and it's like a rotation of savior shield mixed with rejuvenating shield, and this is so good. This is going to keep you alive most of the time with the savior set, and I would highly recommend using this mod for everyone. Even if you aren't using the savior set, even if you're using a 3-piece treacherous tide set, I would highly recommend still using this mod. For the pants mod, we will be using Deadshot, which Deadshot, each crit hit by non-melee weapon grants 5% crit damage up to 45%. This is going to be huge because with this weapon, it is a crit-based weapon. So now we're going to be getting 45% increase in crit damage. And you're going to get to this extremely quickly of how fast this weapon shoots and how much we're going to be critting. So this is a nice consistent damage bonus. Even if you do reload, you will still get that 45% increase in crit damage extremely quickly. And this is just a huge damage bonus on top of everything. We are as well running this in a violent suffix for that crit damage and weapon damage. That is the main point of this weapon, which is why we are stacking so much weapon and crit damage on it. Alright, so getting into the gloves mod, we'll be running crit amplifier, which crit amplifier will give you crit rate plus 10% and crit damage 15%. Now, this is going to be big because you're getting that crit damage and that crit rate. And I'm sure if you hear me say this words again, you're probably going to lose your mind, just like I am right now. But you get the point, and we are running this one in a violent suffix for, you can guess it, that crit damage and weapon damage. But you never saw that one coming, did you? And for the boots mod, we'll be running Rush Hour, which Rush Hour is the god tier, fantastic, holy mother dear Jesus mod. Every 10% HP loss will grant 4% melee weapon and status damage. We don't care about anything except the weapon damage. And let's just be realistic here. You actually can't get that full 40% damage bonus because you will be dead, which we don't want to be dead. However, we will be at 1% HP most of the time, so you will be getting that 36% damage increase, which that is significant. This is one of the big factors why the 3-piece savior set does more damage than the 3-piece treacherous tide set, even though the 3-piece treacherous tide set initially has more of a damage bonus to it. Rush Hour is tied into that because your HP is going to be significantly lower than it would be with the treacherous tide set. So this is going to be a huge damage boost by itself. And as well, we are running this one in a violent suffix for that crit damage and weapon damage. All right, and so moving on to the Cradle. So you want to run anti-phase, tactical combo, marked strike, bounty hunter. And since we are using this with a Fortress Warfare weapon, this is where it gets really big, and you want to run a steady hand, and as well heavy strike, and one of the big ones this season, which is shield protection, which is the new one exclusive to Lunar Scenarios, which when shield is above 40% of max HP, deviant damage reduction plus 10%, and damage to monsters plus 10%, which you are going to be consistently having a shield up at all times. So this is just going to be a nice little damage bonus. And for the last option, depending on whether you're doing Nightmare Silos or not, if you need more than anti-phase, you can use anti-void or anti-coherence. However, if you aren't doing Nightmare Silos or you just don't need it, if you just do enough damage to these other two without it, you can just use the Deviant Energy Defense, which is going to give you 30% increase in shield, which is huge, just by pulling out your deviation. Now, it's only going to last for 30 seconds. However, it is an instant 30% shield. That is huge and very fast to use. And this is the one I would highly recommend for almost everything. However, if you are running a Nightmare Silo and you really do need an anti-void or anti-coherence weapon, you can go ahead and take this off and put this on, and you will be perfectly okay. And for the deviation that you want to use for this build, you want to go with the Lone Wolf Whisper. Now, the Lone Wolf Whisperer just recently got a buff not too long ago, and he now gives you an insane amount of damage buff. So if you're a level 5 Lone Wolf Whisperer, you can get up to 50% extra weapon damage, which is enormous and so beneficial, especially for this weapon. So this is going to skyrocket your damage alone, and this deviation is so incredibly strong. Not only does he give you a huge damage boost, he can also take aggro for you. Alright, so getting into the food buffs that you want to run with the P90, we're going to start off with the mixed fried hot dog. Now, if you are not a chef class, just run this. This alone is going to skyrocket your damage, and you will get 20% more damage against enemies affected by Bullseye. This is huge, and this is going to be like 2 buffs in one, and it will give you so much more damage. Now, if you are a chef class and you are doing bosses, you can pair that mixed fried hot dog with the bone-in deviated sausage for an extra 15% damage against bosses. So it's going to be even more damage going on. And as well, if you are a chef class and you aren't doing strictly just bosses, you can go ahead and pair that mixed fried hot dog with the crumbly bread for an increased 25% weapon damage. And so what's this weapon benefit from the most? It benefits from weapon damage, crit damage, and crit rate. So the crumbly bread is going to give you an enormous buff as well, and I would highly recommend just running the mixed fried hot dog and the crumbly bread if you are a chef class for anything like Nightmare Silos or like Leo Labs. Now, if you're just doing bosses, I would just run the deviated sausage with the mixed fried hot dog, but the mixed fried hot dog is fine by itself if you are not a chef class. But I will say overall that the P90 was one of the funnest and strongest weapons that I have ever used, and I really find it interesting that it does a huge AoE damage proc, especially for a non-elemental weapon. That is probably my favorite thing about it, and I really do hope you guys enjoyed this build, and I will catch y'all in the next one.